Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to the Therapy is Political speaker series. We are so very excited to have you all here in a conversation with Lara Sheehi. She's an author, a clinical psychologist, a research fellow, and the host of the Psychic Militancy podcast. And she's going to be talking to us about her new book, From the Clinic to the Streets, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures. First, we'll start off by introducing ourselves. Therapists for Palestine is a grassroots organization committed to a free Palestine and liberatory movements extending from Turtle Island across the globe. We have a two-pronged mandate to first work with our professional organizations to pass solidarity statements and/or boycott, divest, sanctions motions, also known as BDS, and to include anti-Palestinian racism under their DEI initiatives. Secondly, to institute change and take action in our fields and our work sites to protect, support, and encourage politicized therapists who take pro-Palestinian stances. As settlers on Turtle Island, we recognize that we too are directly implicated in ongoing colonialism on this land and are committed to Indigenous sovereignty, including across the territory now called Ontario, where a lot of our practitioners reside. So this includes land back of so-called crown lands to Indigenous peoples, reparations for lands irreparably damaged, and policies that center Indigenous governance and self-determination. The Therapy is Political speaker series. So in the series, we aim to raise awareness and empower our audiences towards an anti-colonial approach within the mental health field, while strongly maintaining Palestine at the center of our conversations and movements. Along the way, we hope to connect anti-colonial mental health workers to one another and to introduce seekers of psychotherapy services to the liberatory possibilities inherent in anti-colonial therapy. So before we start today, we really do like to encourage folks to take a moment and just reflect. How am I embodying my values and beliefs? Maybe that's decolonization, anti-oppression, social justice in my daily practice. Or if I'm not already, who can I connect with such that we can center our values and our practices? Just going to offer a moment or a few breaths as we land here, even holding this in our hearts and our intention as we go through the conversation today. So thirdly, a note on your donations. So your optional donations upon registering really make it possible and go towards operational costs to run the event, ensuring compensation for the speaker, and all of the other donations from this event will help support, again, excuse my pronunciation, El Tansikiya El Shaibiya. So this is a Lebanese mutual aid campaign for displaced families in Lebanon. Fourthly, so some Zoom housekeeping items. So as you have seen, this event will be recorded. So just keeping that in mind for your own comfort or confidentiality needs as you engage. Please keep yourself muted throughout. And in the chat box, the chat is enabled. So feel free to introduce yourself with your name or profession and location if you feel comfortable. You can also feel free to share reflections, resonances, or questions. We will have people monitoring and synthesizing some of the questions in the chat for a little bit more of a live interactive part later on. There are also moderators present to watch and manage any harm. So anyone who enacts behaviors that are harmful will be immediately removed from the Zoom meeting. So the structure for 1.5 hours together, we're going to have a little bit of a back and forth with Lara focused on topics related to her new book. And time permitting, we're going to open up the floor to other questions. There were lots of common themes even in the questions posed. So chances are, even if you don't get a chance to ask your question directly, my sense is you'll receive a lot of wisdom and find a lot of relevance to your inquiries in the discussion. So before we begin, let me introduce our speaker. Lara Sheehi is a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Services. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and the host of the Psychic Militancy podcast. Lara's work focuses on psychoanalysis, the psychic refusals central to liberation struggles, and life making in the global South, the psychic dimensions of resistance and revolution, and critical Zionism studies. She is co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which won the Middle East Monitor's 2022 Palestine Book Award for Best Academic Book. Lara is a member of the founding collective for the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism and is on the advisory board for forensic architecture. Her new book, just released, congratulations, From the Clinic to the Streets, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, will be released in May by Pluto Press, and we'll have links to get the book posted later as well. Franklin and Kaushiki from the organizing team from Therapists for Palestine will support in the facilitation of the conversation. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it along to Franklin and Kaushiki.
Thank you, Divya. Lara, we're so honored to have you join us the very first day after the publication of your new book. This is it. This will be in many more people's hands soon. We were so lucky to get an early copy. Congratulations, firstly.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having me.
Of course. We're so excited to introduce this book to the audience and really get into it. But before we get into the book, something we really appreciated about your introduction and really throughout the book is that you always situate yourself in it. Especially why you've had to develop your own practice of psychic militancy, which you are now sharing with us. So to start, can you tell us a little more about your personal journey into psychoanalysis and political consciousness, which prompted this specific book?
Yeah, it's always a big question, and no matter how many times you answer it, it continues to be like, oh shit, have I covered everything? First of all, thank you to you all for doing this, Kaushiki, Franklin, for reaching out, organizing. There's so much that goes into this. I'm really appreciative. Divya, thank you for centering us and locating us. And also thank you to you all for holding these spaces. I just want to name up front that prior to this starting, there was a AstroTurf group that posted about this, calling me some sort of cult leader of the of a psychology brand that makes things ideological. Grand coming from people who have an entire consulting team to Zionist settlers about how to do genocide better, or how to pass anti-trans bills in this settler colony, in your settler colony, those of you who are in so-called Canada, and across other settler colonies. So, but this is the world we live in. So I appreciate that you make this space, and I appreciate that you all don't back away from the fight despite threats around it. And maybe that's a segue. That's a good segue about what got me into it. I want to say up front that I'm a Lebanese Arab, and I say it like that because that is a very important piece of this for me. And I say Lebanese Arab because I believe in the liberation of the entire Arab world and region, and for us and for me, that runs through Jerusalem. And the sort of attempts to separate us as Lebanese people, certainly from Palestine, but also just across our region, is part of the ways in which colonialism has enacted its violence on us. So for me, coming into graduate school in psychoanalysis, those things were never up for grabs. And I learned very quickly that that was a problem for the people who were training me, for the field that was very invested in pretending it was neutral, even though part of what I walk through in the book are all the ways in which psychoanalysis tells the story publicly, that it is a neutral field. Psychology in general does this, but I'm focused on psychoanalysis, the field I was reared in. It tells the story that it's a very neutral field. And in fact, your competency ends up getting, measured up against the ways in which how neutral can you be and how do you not impose your agenda That was the entire post, by the way, by the AstroTurf group today about imposing a political agenda. But the story is a different one. It's a sordid story of the repression and oppression and violence against Indigenous, Black, and Brown people the world over, and particularly in the global South. And of course, the suppression of queer and trans people, both in the past and in this day. So for me, I came in being very aware that I couldn't be neutral. That wasn't even an option I had in a white supremacist society. But it was one that I had to learn. What does that mean then? Like, what are the stances that I take? What are the sort of disciplinary action that you get when you actually refuse to be disciplined by a discipline? That sort of markets itself as saying, we know the ways in which, and here are all the things you have to check off for you to be a good clinician. And lo and behold, my entire being was a bad clinician. But it was one in which I knew was actually a politically aligned and ethical position. And I put bad in quotes because I don't believe that. I think, in fact, the positions that people take that say they are not ideological, or that somehow the ideology of allowing a world that we see right now, one in which the conditions for a genocide to happen, or the continuing genocidal colonial logics that we see in both of our settler colonies to continue, we know that psychology has always had a hand in hand with the state in allowing that to happen. So the bad clinician is one that says, I refuse to let you tell this lie, and I refuse to let you do this innocently, and I refuse to be somebody, if I'm going to be in relationship with the state by virtue of my license, then I'm going to be the thorn in the side that rings the alarm at every turn. And I think that's really my journey here. The last thing I'll say about that is, maybe like all of us, there are some points of this in which we are seduced by the lie. And I think an important part of this is also the field lost me and lost maybe all of us. There are many instances in which those of us who care about actually helping people, working towards alleviating psychic suffering, have availed ourselves and made ourselves available, for better or for worse, to some of the disciplinary techniques of these fields. And at every turn, they have made the wrong choice. The field has sided with the state. The field has sided with violence. The field has sided with repressive techniques. The field has sided with cops. The field has sided with ICE agents. I could go on and on and on and on. But I can't sort of locate myself without also telling that story, like the contradictions and the ways in which where we end up is a place that's forged through a lot of sort of learning firsthand what it means to be racialized, gendered, and have a normative psychological practice that not just by accident doesn't attend to us, but actually never intended to begin with.
Thank you. That locates you very fully in in the work in the work that you do. And you often state that psychoanalysis starts with Fanon. Sadly, and not coincidentally, he's typically excluded in psychotherapy training. This is part of the disciplining. Yeah, so not everyone knows him. Could you situate Fanon for us and tell us how he used psychoanalysis in resistance? How did he seize it, and how did he make it work for liberatory means?
Yes, I love this question, and I love it because anytime I get invited to talk about Fanon is a good time. So we're here for it. Frantz Fanon, I mean, right off the bat, he was a Black revolutionary, anti-colonial, Marxist psychoanalyst, psychiatrist. And I say all those things because oftentimes he's only known, and certainly he needs to be known as this, as a revolutionary Black man. And then in academia, he ends up in sort of post-colonial studies or Black studies where he belongs. But it's not by chance also that he never is included in the clinical canon. And I think anybody who sort of reads Frantz Fanon and his work and his commitment to understanding the material conditions, and in his case, it was both racism and colonialism, which work hand in hand together with state oppression, that those structures and their mechanics and their logics are what directly can be linked to the immense psychic suffering that people have to endure, and have to endure to the point of being tasked with their own suffering and their healing at the same time, under conditions that would never allow that, right? There are contradictions to the expectations that people are under, colonized people are under. And I think this is part of what he gifts us, is an unbending militant position around the structures that cause suffering, rather than the individualized localizing something in the individual and reading that as a pathology. So by and large, that is what Fanon is for us. The other thing that Fanon is for us, and that I sort of talk about, is he gives us a distinct psychoanalytic and clinical grammar from the global South. Frantz Fanon belongs to the global South. And he died in the United States. He died very early on, in his 30s. A lot of folks will, sort of question and say he died in CIA custody. I think all those things are really important. But what I often also say is that we need to sort of pay attention to the ways in which the story of Frantz Fanon dying early is not a new story about Black men dying early or people of color dying early. And that is precisely what his work also offers us, is a mapping out of all these different positions and sort of structural pressures that might cause people to suffer and actually shorten their lifespan, because they are under so much duress and expectations to thrive. And they do, because that's the other piece. And they do. And they win their own liberation in the same time. The other thing that he gives us is clinical papers. He was a clinician through and through. And so, in 2019, the collection of his clinical papers are finally translated for us. And when you read them, they're so beautiful in that he shows us that you actually don't have to make the choice between the social and the political and the psyche. And this was in the 1950s. So when we see as clinicians, I imagine there are many clinicians among us here, when we see these sort of Eurocentric spaces, bringing out all and with all the stops except for Palestine, of course, we know where all of this ends, about, it's sort of the sense of like, we're inventing a read on racism. And all this is what I mean about like a grammar from the global South that says those of us who've had to live in the same world as white supremacy, which is all of us, but those of us who also might be disproportionately affected by being under the boot of imperialism, colonialism, settler colonialism, racial capitalism, have never not thought about these things. And Frantz Fanon comes along again in the 1950s and says, here's a whole host of ways we've been thinking about this. We actually don't need a European invention to tell us this. So when I make the provocation that psychoanalysis begins with Fanon, in many ways, I understand what it is I'm actually saying. And I understand also because psychoanalysts melt down. They're just like, what are you talking about? Freud was the start. No, God forbid we not begin with Freud. And I always say, like, this is not a glitch in the timeline. This is us saying and making known up front that this is a political position we are taking. And if we are to take seriously the sort of disruption of a white supremacist Eurocentric hold on our field, we need to be able to do something like that and say, does not begin with Freud, it begins with Fanon. The final thing I'll say about this is it begins with Fanon because we also have a commitment to truth-telling, which is what Fanon did in unflinching ways, is continuously tell the truth about the conditions that he found people in as a result of colonialism. He didn't shy away from that. And I think when we say we begin with Fanon, there's also a way in which we are announcing to the world, this is where I stand on things. Because everything in psychology, if we think about psychoanalysis and psychology as a European invention, we have to then locate it in Europe and understand that the making of Europe is also alongside the plunder, extraction, and exploitation of the global South in every way, and also the use, misuse, and abuse of Indigenous Black and Brown bodies to excavate psychological knowledge. This is not a controversial statement. This is descriptive. And it's a horrific descriptive statement, but it's one that we need to keep saying. And I think so if we were to borrow anything from Fanon, it's about the way in which he doesn't take a breath in continuously telling us over and over and over and over again that these are the conditions of the way that our field came into being, but also the conditions that everyday people live in.
Thank you for speaking so compellingly and lucidly about Fanon. And you spoke about how Fanon brings a grammar from the global South, and I want to move to the grammar that you bring from the global South, and it's in the lineage of Fanon. And I want to get like right into the book. From the clinic to the streets. And one of your core offerings in this book is that you give us a process to identify and resist the psychic intrusions that are constantly leveled at us from systems of oppression. Can you speak a little bit about, and I'm asking this question so that we can have this frame to get into other questions that ask about the concepts. So could you speak a little bit about what are psychic intrusions? And what does it mean to be psychically militant in the face of psychic intrusions?
Yes. It's really interesting because, we write books and then you're just like, how do I even explain these concepts that are in here? So sometimes you go back and you're like, what did I actually say? But no. So I think let me start with psychic intrusions. And psychic intrusions are sort of, think about them as anything that has the intent on intruding on our psychic space and settling inside of us with the purpose of rearranging what our interior world looks like. Okay, that can look like propaganda. This is what the book goes through: psychological operations, for example, psyops, what we colloquially know as psyops. So that can look like what we see in the media, we see what reality is, and then we watch the media and you're living in an entirely different universe, right? What I'm interested in is like there's an entire arm of the state that actually generates psyops. They generate it to make us feel like there are no other options, that we have already lost. This also is, by the way, capitalism, the way that it makes us think that we need to consume to feel better, but then we end up feeling more shitty about ourselves. It could be that. But what I'm interested in the book is also all the ways, in the mundane ways, that psychic intrusions by systems of power come through us and mobilize things we already have inside of us: emotions, affect, ideas about ourselves and the world. And that works on unconscious levels, of course. So I call it the psychopolitical affective space or terrain. Psychoaffective comes from Fanon. And then I add political because my point about psychic intrusions is they're not after effects. They're not just accidental. It's not like oppression happens and then we have a symptom. What I started to realize over time was our psyche is actually the target. And intrusion is the way that oppressive systems get inside of us and then sit inside of us and then disappear and make us think this is just a natural part of our lives, right? So I use, for example, affect states: despair, confusion, fear. And those are the sort of primary things that I'm thinking about. Not to say that those affect states don't exist in and of themselves, but to say that because we call it an intrusion, we're also saying there's something directed that is happening here. And that allows us to think that anytime we feel these affect states, to at least ask the question about the possibility of it being mobilized in that moment towards a certain end, right? That power not only implants things in us, but this is the grammar part of it, is when does it turn on the switch so that this mobilizes in a particular way. And for me, what I've noticed is because it's a political project, the mobilization is precisely to disconnect us from our political commitments, from not being able to track material reality right in front of our eyes. Even as material reality is in front of us, we feel crazy. We end up questioning ourselves and being like, is this what's actually happening in front of me, even though we all know? And I think that's where the idea came from, is that over and over again, particularly after Tawafan al-Aqsa in October 2023, over and over again, whether I was speaking with comrades or friends or patients on the couch, so to speak, the reframe over and over again would be, I feel crazy, Lara. And the disconnect was that people would say, it's not the fact that people say I feel crazy. There's a lot of things that are happening in our world that are truly mind-boggling and go beyond sometimes our capacity to sort of take in or metabolize. That wasn't the interesting thing to me. What I saw in a patterned way, which is also why I call it a grammar, a psychic grammar, because there's a pattern and almost like a rule to it. What I saw over and over again is in the same breath that people would say, I feel crazy, they could recount to me in excruciating detail what the actual material reality was. There was nothing missing about their apprehension of what was happening, right? Their ability to see in front of them exactly what was happening, but still feel like they were going crazy. That's when I started thinking about intrusions. I was like, there's something that's happening here that's playing, here's borrowing from Sarah Ahmed, on us and through us, right? To reconfigure something. And then I extended it, and this is where Fanon helps and structural sort of analysis helps, is thinking about if the point of, let's say, Zionism, which is why Palestine factors so heavily in this book, but I also talk about capitalism and imperialism, if their job is to expand, they're expansionist projects. I started to also recognize, and this is the intrusion piece, that they could not fulfill their fullest violent intent without stealing our mind as well. So it really positions us, when we call them intrusions, we're also saying our psyche is contested space. It is not a foregone conclusion, right? Because it can feel nihilistic. A lot of people, if I'm saying, hey, they're going to target our mind, and here's this entire state operation that's built to be able to do that. And they call themselves Psy warriors, by the way. It sounds absurd, but they call themselves Psy warriors because they pray, and they literally say, we pray on these emotions like fear and all of that. And they know exactly what they're doing. There's an entire operation that's happening and has been happening since the 1940s, right? We can look at that and it can feel nihilistic and can be like, well, what chance do we have? But here's the psychic militancy piece of it, is that I would say is that if power could settle within us with just one attempt, there would not need to be decades-long sharpening of these tools and a repetitious force of violence over and over again, and a borrowing from each other to see how to do this, and billions of dollars put into it, and an incessant saturation of our life so that this takes hold. For me, that's a good news. That's being like, hey, this shit's not easy. And for me, the militancy piece is, at the very least, we don't allow them to settle inside of us without being antagonistic and without giving them hell and without making it difficult for them to do that. So at the very least, to recognize and acknowledge that it is happening. And I think sometimes one of the things that I realized is these things to us feel like they're small. But that's part of it, is that they make us feel small. They make us feel like we've already lost. They make us feel like everything, it will always be as it is. They conscript us and seduce us and reduce our capacity to imagine and believe. And yet, we have Tawafan al-Aqsa. And yet, we have Hezbollah fighting a fight in Lebanon, right? With drones that can't be detected. And yet we have the student intifada, right? We have communities resisting ICE. We have all these examples in front of us. And the intrusion is to make us look away from that, misattune away from that, and instead think there's nothing that can be done. The psychic militancy element of that is, can we hold on to with repetition? And that's why I say psychic militancy is also a conscious political project of repetition and commitment to remain attuned to all the possibilities that are in front of us and never allow the capture that power intends on to tell us all of these are foreclosed conclusions. Anytime we feel like something is fixed, it's a clue to us that intrusion is happening, right? So I'm feeling despairing. It's not to say we shouldn't, because the magnitude and the sheer violence in front of us can make us feel like that. But to ask, what is actually being done in that moment when I am feeling despairing? Who am I being asked to disidentify from? Who am I asked to identify with in that moment, right? What does despair actually do in this moment? And who does that disconnect me from? And in service of what? That tracing is also Fanonian in as much as he talks about disalienation, of always being able to hold, to remain tethered to the structural pieces that are at play, rather than to sort of close in on ourselves and think this is an individual process that's happening to me. So that's a sort of large swath. I know I said a lot, but I'm here for all the follow-up questions.
That's great. I have a follow-up question, but I have my eyes on the time, and we're going to hand it over to Franklin. If we have time, I'll ask.
There's so many follow-up questions.
Yeah, exactly.
To pare down our questions. But that was a really great setup for something we wanted to get into, which is the challenge and messiness of identifying psychic intrusions and being with them, and naming them together. Those four affective states you name in the book: despair, exhaustion, fear, confusion, that I'm crazy moment. Like they're so relatable, and we see them so much like in our work with clients and movement spaces, and you give examples in the book that are really grounding and illuminating. And when I read that, I thought, these feelings really encapsulate why we started Therapists for Palestine. We know so many people are feeling this way, and that is very demobilizing and isolating, if we don't make sense of them collectively. And something you know in the book is that shame is a common response to these feelings, which makes it harder to bring up and identify and process together and make sense of. And you just named like attachments to power as part of the psychic intrusions that happen, and that especially can provoke a lot of shame. It feels like a betrayal to movements. It feels like an individual weakness. So I appreciated that you really highlighted that conflict comes up throughout the book. So knowing that shame is a challenge as we heed the call to psychic militancy, I'd love to hear more about how you see shame attaching to psychic intrusions, how you see it circulating in movements or clinical spaces, and how your work, I think, really disrupts that process, that cycle of shame that happens.
Thank you for that and for drawing it out. I appreciate it. And I think all of us who are engaged in these processes know it very well, which is why I'm like, hey, folks, this is not about shaming ourselves around this. If psychic intrusions have a point, the point is to deflect, derail us, delegitimize our movements and our political commitments, stop us in our tracks, disconnect us from others, atomize us. That's the political project. And that's why I call them and intrusions have different ways. Gaslighting might be one of them. It's not, it's one of many things. The propaganda that I was talking about. But really, if we just start it at its base, is that the point of a psychic intrusion is to settle internally and induce an action within us. And that action is foremost a political project of stopping us from our political commitments and our certainty that liberation is possible, right? That's in a nutshell. If that's the case, then we can also understand shame as being involved in that. How can it not be? Right. And so it's not to say don't have the affect. That's what I never want. It's to always say, can we retain our capacity to understand that if our world is saturated by violent processes that intend to actually atomize us, how can we imagine that any of the affect states we are feeling are separate from that? So it gives us a little bit of psychic space to say, let me question why in this moment is this being mobilized in this particular way? And if I'm feeling shameful, what is the actual after effect of this? What's its actual impact in my real world, right? And oftentimes when we feel shame, we also retreat from people. we don't talk to our friends, our comrades, the people that we're working with. We cut off, social relations. And for me, in the height of something, especially if you're organizing and you are succumbing to that, that is part of the political project. And that's the other thing, is like, there's nothing about this that is innocent. Psychic intrusions are studied, they are purposeful, they are calculated, they are clinical. I spent a lot of time for this book reading counterinsurgency manuals of these people who make up psychological operations. And all of them across the board say a couple things. The through line, like, they're different in different ways, and they say, they specify certain techniques, and they give, they're ridiculous across the board, but they're violent because they're attached to the machinery of violence and the most cruel empire in the world, usually, right? But one of the things that they say is, none of this is new. There is nothing mysterious about what we do. We make sure to make people feel bad about themselves. And when people feel bad about themselves and shameful and all these things, they are less likely to organize. They are less, and here's the important piece, they are less likely to support liberation movements. They actually say this, that when people feel these ways, these affect states, they then turn on the people in their communities that are fighting these fights. The other thing that they say is that militants, and this is the piece that's why the antidote, I think, to shame is the militancy, at least in naming how the shame can be connected to a larger project of making us feel this way. That's part of the militancy, right? Is always knowing power is at play. So the other thing they say is militants are the hardest people to change their mind. So even when psychological operations of, like, military psychological operations go into leftist countries and try to fuck with their people and change their mind, across the board, what these manuals say is militants are hard to change. Don't even try. Don't waste your time working to make the militant change their position. What you do instead is make people hate them, is make stuff up about them, is make people believe that if the militant weren't here, their conditions would be better. Make people believe that it's actually the militant who's fighting for liberation that's the one that's wrong, not the intruder, right? Is make people feel bad about themselves, their community, their families, so on and so forth. So it's like, for me, when I see this, I mean, it's horrific and it's disgusting, and we should be horrified that there are manuals for this. And it's also a counterforce manual for us to be like, they're telling the truth about this. They're out there being like, hey, here's what we do. This is how we mess with you. So that's why I say every time we have an affect state like this, especially shame, because we know what it demobilizes, is to, in that moment, go, all right, there might be something happening here. And to do that relationally, all the examples I give in the book are ones that happen in relation. They're not ones that are stories of, oh, people caught themselves beforehand and were able. It was just like, no, look at the ways in which these things happen in mundane situations. And I'm very careful and very interested in the mundane, because the spectacular is easy to see. It's easy for us to look and say the Zionist settler genocidal state is engaging in psychic inversions. Like, we know who the killers are. That's easy. Even though we still be like, I feel like I'm going crazy, the large part is easier to see. The mundane is a place where things have already transformed into normativity, and it gets much harder for us to notice. And that's the place of psyops and psychic intrusions, where they're, and that's why I use those examples, because it's already been transformed. And what I sort of try and walk through are the ways in which people, politically engaged people, because that's who I'm concerned with. I don't care about liberals. I'm cared about people who are engaged in struggle. And on the one hand, we're the most people who are targeted. It's actually because you are in struggle that you are targeted, and the intrusions will come harder. because you are actually shifting something. So that's the final thing I'll say about shame is like, of course it's going to come. When we feel shame, it's just like, I hope that means that we are actually engaging in disruptive process, because that is when violence comes down the hardest on us. It's in those moments where we're wrenching ourselves from the identifications with power. We're in Fanon's disalienation, that we're going to feel it the most, because those are the people they target, right? Again, their manuals give us so much. That's why I'm like, seize psychoanalysis and use it, seize this and use it for the revolution, because they give us a manual.
Yeah, they show us the way in a bizarre sense. Um, I, I, I'm really intrigued by what you say about how there is nothing about psychic intrusions that is innocent. And I'm wondering, and this is now my follow-up question, I'm just going to ask it, Franklin. I'm wondering if there are ever accidents in psychic intrusions. And I'll tell you why I'm asking this, because I immigrated here to what is now called Canada a few years ago. And when I immigrated, I came with my kids who were 7 at the time, and 7-year-olds making sense of everything new, do it by playing. So they were playing out all their experiences with their toys. So the first couple of weeks, they went to school and they came back home, and then they set up their toys like a classroom and played what in India we would call school, right? Make believe classroom. So they set up their toys like students in class. They had a teacher, and then they had the loudspeaker come on, because that's what happens in these schools. And they recited the land acknowledgement of Canada, yeah. Except instead of saying the official land acknowledgement, which is we acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron, the Wendat, they mistakenly said what they had taken in. They said out loud and clear, we have landed upon the Mississaugas and the Anishinaabeg. It was incredible. So I read that as after reading your book, I read that as a leakage in an attempted mundane psychic intrusion. It is a psychic intrusion, right? Because the land acknowledgement is made with no intent of any kind of material return. And so I've been wondering if you ever notice leakiness or accidents in psychic intrusions, and how can we actively look for it?
Yeah. I mean, what a confession, right? And I think that's part of it, is that I mean, we can be very psychoanalytic and call it a parapraxis. Like, this was just a slip of the tongue. But what I'm interested in is, less accidental and more, what are the messages that your kids have been getting across the board that are saturated? And the psychic intrusion is a saturation that hides in plain sight and doesn't allow us to track it, but that they can still retain clarity, whether they know it or not, to be able to say it in this way. There are many ways in which settler colonial societies not only speak out of both sides of their mouth, but continue to engage in genocidal process. Right? I mean, think about how many missing and murdered Indigenous sisters every single day in the settler state now known as Canada's supposedly the nicer settler colony. Right? Or the ways in which this farce of repair is meant to sort of be a balm for the sins of settler colonialism that continue to this day. Your kids live in that world, right? And they take it in. And yes, there's something about their psychic space that still is able to leak, as you say. What I'm interested in, and why I want psychic militancy to sort of be something we think about, are all the ways that over the course of a lifetime, through carceral discipline, we lose the ability to remain tethered to that, what looks like a parapraxis, but actually is a retention of material reality. And we lose that in many different ways. In our field, it is purposeful. It is hammered out of us. And it is hammered out of us because being political means you are less competent. It means you are too identified with your patient. It means that you can't possibly see everything all at once. It means you can't be neutral, all the things we know. It means that you should be able to work with white supremacists, because why can't you work with everybody, right? All those things are examples clinically of how we are disciplined out of that parapraxis. And again, for me, that's a mark of reality testing. It's not a parapraxis. But even that, right? Psychoanalysis, let me use this as an example. Psychoanalysis, having that term parapraxis, like somehow this is a slip rather than what would it be for us to call that a psychic inversion? And in fact, say all these slips are actually what are reality. This is reality. And then to track over the course of a lifetime, and certainly when we're in fields like this, of how we are systematically, persistently, and consistently disciplined out of the ability to remain connected to reality. That's a psychic intrusion. Anything that does that is a psychic intrusion. A response to that is psychic militancy, right? Is that if, let's see the land acknowledgement, if we are to do a land acknowledgement, it is one, like in the Fanonian fashion, that connects that statement to land back, right? To the fact that this is not a thing of the past, that this is a continuous process, and that every single process infrastructure that is built by the settler is one that will ensure their longevity, certainly not that of the indigenous people, and not ours who are fighting for a better world. That's the psychic militancy. Sometimes we can think, but Lara, this is so small. But again, if we think about the daily repetition of this propaganda that's shoved down our throats, for me, there is nothing small enough to repeat. It's our repetition, just like your kids in play. I love the play example because play is repetition, right? Is not to shy away from that and not to feel badly that we continue to repeat things like, no, I live in a settler colony, and this settler colony is engaged in genocidal process and has been since its inception, because that is the point of settler colonialism. It is an annihilationist, eliminationist, racist, white supremacist project. And we need to continuously say that, because everything in our world wants to bend us away from that by making you feel like you're too much, by making you feel like you're just repeating an axiom, a truth that everybody already knows, by making you feel like you're going to be the feminist killjoy in the room, by making you feel like, oh my gosh, here I am again, by making you feel like you might be in a field that this has no relevance to, right? If settler colonialism exists, it's because it mobilizes every single structure and process to make itself relevant and continue. That's why we need to disrupt every single process so that it can't.
Thank you. It's quite amazing to think about parapraxis as a retention of material reality, right? And that's at the core of psychic militancy, is that remembering and repetition of material reality. Yeah. Franklin, I'll pass it to you for your question.
Thank you. We're a room full of many therapists are here. So I know lots of people submitted questions about how to bring these concepts from the clinic to the streets, but also back to the clinic, having been in the streets, how that changes the clinic space for us. So one of my fears that I know a lot of us hold in coming into the psychotherapy profession is this very insidious way that therapy can become this demobilizing and distracting self-project of healing. Even when we are aware of that, we know it's a risk, we're trying not to go there, even our clients might be trying not to go there, it happens. So I really appreciated in the book that you bring this in, that push to self-blame, to change our interiority. It's just such a constant psychic intrusion, and it's provoked by just the therapy space even. So you caution us against folding psychic militancy into that kind of self-project of like purifying ourselves from psychic intrusions. Right? You explicitly say there's no like pure psychic place we can just get to and get rid of all the intrusions. And there's something really important that you emphasize there about collectively countering, like you were saying, it's a relational process. this is not an individual project or an individual failure when it happens. So can you talk more about that kind of conflict that may inevitably come up for people as we read, even though like we see it, we disagree with it, but that psychic intrusion comes where we may feel a pull to take psychic militancy as a call for purity or something to idealize or measure ourselves or each other against.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would come back to the idea of always recognizing that we live in a world where power harnesses and marshals everything against us to make us feel certain ways, and that feeling is not just to feel like that. It's to disconnect us from the larger question of liberation. And I say the certainty that that will happen, right? That will happen because we see it imploding on itself. Like this is not a world that can continue in the form that it is. What that form will take is something that is in constant emergence, right? So when I caution us that there's not a place to reach to, it's cautioning us against the ossification. That's a conservative position to say, I'm going to struggle, and then I'm going to get to this place. And then finally, I'm going to be done with the struggle. That if power recalibrates right in front of our eyes and does everything to ensure that it can keep going, right? Fanon talks about it, and I'm paraphrasing here. He says, colonialism is not a thinking machine. It just thinks about its own perpetual process, its own longevity. Then we also have to rid ourselves of the idea that somehow getting to a place and sitting there is what is success. There's nothing more for the clinicians in the room. That's therapy. Like, we don't just get to a place. If you are a living being, we are constantly in dynamic process because we are interacting with the world. We're interacting with each other. The world is changing. So I feel like in many ways we might be primed as clinicians to actually understand the process, even though we too live in the world and are under the duress of this political project that makes us think we need to get to this one place, right? If we can think about that goal of getting to the one place and settling, and I'm using that word on purpose, is to think about the intent of thinking there's a pure place we can settle. That politically, that's why I think it's a political problem. Once we think about it in those terms, we're just like, oh, it jars us. We're just like, oh, that actually has a meaning. That can't be neutral, right? It's getting to a place and then somehow there's no movement that happens. Nothing good comes out of stasis, right? Like, think about what happens to water when it doesn't move. It's putrid and disgusting and causes disease, right? So I think I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but I also don't. And I think the fantasies of a return, like somehow pre-Eurocentric white supremacy, or a return to a certain place, or if only I could just get myself to do this better, are also all the ways in which, like, I think liberal humanist values and stuff make us believe in this myth, the hardworking myth, the re-individualizing ourselves even when we're not individuals. Like, these are all the sneaky ways that this stuff is still lodged inside of us, even when politically we are actually committed against those things. So it's also to notice it in front of us. Like, what is this return? Because the final thing I'll say about that is, this is what I meant by, if we are in struggle, the intrusions are going to come. In fact, that's when you're going to really feel them, because that shit closes down so quickly. All of us who have been attacked, who know what it is to speak up, know that, like, all these systems, especially the clinical field, love to think of themselves as expansive, right? I want every brown, black, queer, trans person in the world to be in my space. And then the second that you are one of those people with your politics, with your unbending politics, the shit closes down so quickly, right? And it tells on itself. So also, that's the other thing. How can we, number one, listen to systems when they tell on themselves? And number two is understand that if the system is in constant struggle over your psyche, we also have to be in constant struggle for our psyche. And that can sound exhausting, but what I've heard actually is the opposite. It's actually the intrusions that are exhausting. It's at the end of the day when we feel like we are forcibly static and demobilized that is actually exhausting. Struggling for a better world and retaining our ability to actually believe in it, not as a fantasy, but as a reality. And with that, see all the examples in front of us that show us that. Like, you all as a group are an example of that. And it emerged in a time, and like maybe 5 years ago, this wasn't even an idea in people's mind, but it emerges and it grows and it responds to a particular moment. And this formation could not have been possible without the struggle that preceded it, right? And then what you become after the fact, and how do we not ossify in those spaces? So I think I suppose this is what, constantly being engaged in dialectical process is about, is you commit to moving, you commit to the politics that are involved in that, and you also commit to a constant tracing of how power works. Because power is predictable. Power follows a logic. It's a portable logic. It might look differently in different places, but like, that shit's the same. And they learn from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, it's the intrusions that are exhausting, and it's the militancy that is vitalizing. Yeah. We have so many questions, but we're mindful of the time. So I will ask our last question to Lara, and we'll open it up for audience questions. And if we can, we'll jump back in there with all the questions that we have prepared. Okay, so through T4P, we talk a lot about divesting from psychotherapy institutions, that refuse to even acknowledge the genocide in Palestine and Zionist aggression in Lebanon, much less work to end it. That's one of the reasons that T4P exists, Therapists for Palestine. It's meant to be a structure of support for politicized therapists committed to dismantling oppressive systems. One thing we've been trying to work through is when to divest from institutions and when to invest political energies into them. You speak about seizing psychoanalysis, and the parallel here is, when do we seize institutional structures? Can you help us to think through this?
Yeah, it's such an excellent question. And I'm not sure that I have a prescription, right? Just like everything we've been saying. And I don't think you're asking for that, but it bears saying that, is there is no prescription. And I think we learn our way through these things, right? What I often say, and maybe this is the anarchist in me, is you're in institutions until you're not. And that I say that just like as though that's a simple statement, but I know it's not. But what would it mean for us to constantly be within and committed to the political project of navigating and checking in on our investments in institutions? Can we divest from the investments in them? Because that's the thing, is like, if we can be there and disrupt their process and be a thorn in their sides and make them look at themselves, and at the very least say, I'm not going to let you get to talk about this and feel comfortable. That might be a political strategy. And then at some point it won't be. And then that's the time for us to contend with, are there parts of me that are invested in this space that I actually didn't even know were invested in this space? And if so, why? Is there a social currency that comes with it? Is there something that is still lodged inside of us from our field and from other spaces that tells us there's some legitimacy that comes with this? Is there a part of us that believes in the liberal humanist lie, right? That these spaces are the places where real change can happen. Or that if we soften ourselves and learn to fit within these spaces, then we can bring people over to our side, right? And I say this with kind of mockingly, but I think it needs to be, because that's what divestment means. It means being strategic about being in places, but understanding that the people who will join us in the struggle will join us in the struggle whether or not we meet them in these structures, right? And the investment that I would say to divest from is all the social energies that goes into making people believe our position, because that always means we are compromising. Can you stay in spaces and be unbending and militant? That's your question. If you can't, leave. right? And just one final thing from firsthand experience, and I see some people in the room here who also have firsthand experience of this. They'll come at you, and that's part of it, is being a militant in whatever space it is, whether you're a militant like armed struggle militant, or being a militant and being unbending about your political positions and your fight for liberation, wherever that may be, means you also have a different relationship to risk, and you do it anyway because you understand there's something larger at stake and that you are committed to, and that the losses that come are losses in a particular way of the world being configured like that, but they might not be losses in the larger scale of things, right? Because in my experience with significant losses, career-wise or anything like that, there are also many possibilities of connection and solidarity and world building that open up. And that's something an oppressor just doesn't get, you know. I hope that wasn't too glib. I really believe it.
No, not at all. It was really clarifying, is what it was. Thank you. Well, let's move to audience questions now. And so I'll invite Tala and Tanya to come on screen and read out any questions from the audience that we've received.
All right. Thank you, Lara, so much for being with us tonight and for all of your work, really. And thank you, Franklin and Kaushiki, for facilitating. We have so many amazing connections, by the way, being made in the chat. It's really beautiful to see, and many thank yous and many people feeling inspired. So I know you can't read the chat at the same time, so I just wanted to share that. The first question is, someone shared this before the talk today. So as a teacher, how do you politicize therapists? How do you go about engaging psychotherapists in political work in a way that can be meaningful and even shocking without scaring them away?
That's a great question. And also, you know, just a shout out again to our Zionist trolls who, like, their position is like, oh, you know, Lara or whoever else is their target is radicalizing people or politicizing them. And so what I would say to people as a reminder that it already is. It already is. Right? And I say that and it can sound like so banal, but that's to speak to the fear part of it, like scaring them away, is that they live in a world that is already politicized ideologically in particular directions. And I think speaking to that, normalizing our ability to talk about that and saying, you know, you're coming into this field with all these, let's say, assumptions around neutrality, or that somehow you're not a political being, and yet you are. And we go from there. We unpack it from there. It's about sort of speaking to the things that are never meant to be spoken. That, by the way, when they're not spoken, they're unevenly distributed to be spoken and felt by the most vulnerable people among us, like everyday life. Who holds the knowledge that we live in a political world every single day, right? It's those who are always doing that. The world, it's the people who live in the, you know, the parallel universe to white people, right? That don't have to live in that world. So that's the other part, is to say to teachers or to clinicians is, number one, you're not importing anything. I get that a lot. People are just like, but you're importing an agenda. And I'm just like, no, I'm just naming reality. These are not controversial statements. These are non-negotiable starting points. Racism exists. Settler colonialism exists. Sexism exists. Cis heteropatriarchy is a thing. These are non-negotiable starting points that I have learned actually open up the possibility for students to explore and make meaning at a level that positioning ourselves as neutral up front, being like, let's explore if racism exists because I don't want to impose anything on you, doesn't do. It doesn't do. It closes everything down, right? So I would say this is also a great example of the psychic intrusion of fear, right? The articulation of without making them afraid or to run that is the thing, is like, if there is a fear, that fear is an implant that already is doing a thing to them. It is making them believe in a world order in which they can believe in the fantasy that they are non-political beings, or that through therapy we could get there, right? We could be able to do therapeutic work that's not political. So truth telling and naming, really non-negotiable. And I call these in classes, I'm like, these are our non-negotiable starting points. I'm here to work through all the identifications we have that make those things hard to hold on to. That's what my job, that's what my role is when I'm in the classroom, is to be like, with these non-negotiable truths come all these investments that you have been brought up on that make it really hard to sit with the fact that this is a non-negotiable truth. That's my job to do, right? Is to hold that with you and to say those identifications are real. And they're real because these structures of power make them real. How do we continue? How do we sit with them and critically engage them? But it's never to say, let's explore and get to the fact of racism. That's up front. That's those political positions and truths always have to be front-ended.
Thank you for that, Lara. I have another question that came ahead of time. It says, I work a lot with complex childhood trauma and often find that clients need to heal early personal trauma to enhance safety and energy prior to engaging politically with collective trauma. How can we encourage clients to engage politically throughout their healing process? And I would add, maybe help them see that in doing so, that is part of the healing process, or maybe part of the work.
Yeah. I think there's something about what I was just saying earlier about naming a non-negotiable truth about the world that patients live in, that in every other space in their life, they have to fight to prove that actually exists, right? And because that's the way that hegemonic structures are set up, not because we choose them that way, that even as people navigate their worlds, they're going to come up against roadblocks that might, accept them for their difference, but they are still having to tell that story. And the internalized feeling is that I need to prove this every single time. And I can't let go of that because I'm up against all these systems that would tell me actually that the reference point is something else, right? These are the sort of, ways that these things hide this is ideology, or hides, or these psychic intrusions, right? So how do we help them? Number one is to commit ourselves to the process of naming without fear that somehow that's going to impose something, or that's a political agenda, or we're going to, psychoanalytically people would say, but you're going to ruin the transference. And I'm just like, then you don't believe in your own theory. Like you can't, transference will emerge no matter, like theoretically, if you actually follow the theory, it'll emerge no matter what you do, right? So it's also about, and the unconscious has all these different ways of working. So perhaps in a tongue-in-cheek way is like, don't be afraid that you're going to break something in the therapeutic space, and recognize that upfront, positioning yourself as someone who folks don't have to convince does not close down the possibility of them continuing to make meaning out of what that is for them. We don't foreclose possibilities of growth by saying yes upfront, right? I also have a example in the book. One of the clinical examples in the book is of a patient, a Congolese woman who was working in a nonprofit industry and who's actually politically committed. And a lot of it was her, feeling conflicted around this. And one of the things that she brought in was being really angry with the word and the phrase senseless violence. And we spent a lot of time sort of taking seriously why that word senseless brought up so much in her. And my commitment to my political world is what allowed me to see this was not a displacement. Like her old therapist would tell her, you're intellectualizing or you're using this as a displacement for everything else. Can we look at the real issues? We're always taught what comes in front of us, like we're always digging for what is behind it. But here she was telling me there's something about this word senseless violence that really gets under my skin and does it. And because of both of our political commitments, we were able to make a lot of meaning about the heavy lifting that word was doing. And what she was really upset about was the coercive relational engagements that she was under in her workspace. When people said that word, right, they didn't just want her to accept it. They wanted her to engage in that political analysis when everything inside of her said there's nothing senseless about the violence that is done in the Congo. That this is an entire structural setup, right? I'm using that as an example because I think, again, to really take seriously the examination of what hesitation we have and why, and what does that, why is it mobilized in that way? This is another example of a psychic intrusion. If you have a fear about bringing in the political. I've never met anybody who doesn't know the source of their suffering viscerally or who's causing their suffering. Now, how it shows up that way, why it does, what complicates it, all of that. Those things get in the way. But generally speaking, people understand the conditions they live in that cause their suffering. So if we are worried about naming a thing that they know is in their world, that's a good chance for us to be like, where is this hesitation coming from and how did it come to live inside of me to the degree that it is disrupting my process in this room? Right? That's another way we can sort of use this, a tracking of a psychic intrusion and a psychic militancy in response to it.
Thank you. Question that came up from Mahed, clarifying question. Is Fanon at the origin of psychoanalysis because he defined psychoanalysis outside of the European colonial first principles?
In my world, yes. I don't know about other people. In my world, absolutely. And he did so unbendingly. And he did so as somebody who was trained psychoanalytically, which I think is really important because psychoanalysis is obsessed with its lineages and obsessed with people being properly trained psychoanalysts, which is when you hear some of these ridiculous arguments around Fanon, they're like, but he wasn't really a psychoanalyst. And I'm just like, black skin, white mask, like literally the fourth page, he says, I'm a Marxist first, I'm a psychoanalyst second. He tells us he's a psychoanalyst. All the ways in which he engages with this tells us he's a psychoanalyst. He believes in the unconscious. He believes in the transference. He believes in really like all of this is psychoanalysis. So, yeah, but he disrupts it in a really important way. And so much so that he continues to not be taught in psychoanalytic spaces. On the one hand, psychoanalysis, mainstream psychoanalysis, will say there's a renaissance of Fanon, which tells us everything we need to know, because to me, that's a confession of white supremacy of like, you think it's a renaissance because you're seeing it now or you're doing it, but like most of the world and globally has always used Fanon. This is not new, right? But it's good to know where people stand. This is your first introduction to him, but then you center yourself because that's what settlers and colonizers do. It's on first contact that things exist, right? But that's, I think, that this is part of us for us to think is he disrupts the story that psychoanalysis tells about itself. And that's the thing also, is to think about in engaging in psychic militancy like he does, can we also ask of ourselves, whether in the clinic or in the streets, what are we doing to disrupt the story that power tells about itself? Right? And expects to not be challenged by it. And I think Fanon was committed to challenging the story that power tells about itself at every turn.
Somebody was also asking about trainings on psychoanalysis from a Fanonian lens. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation.
Yeah.
Are there any out there that you can recommend?
Right now, I don't know any off the top of my head. Actually, that's not true. I do know. The Abolition School, that is based in Philadelphia and co-founded by a dear comrade, Gio Mar. I'll link it in the chat. They are, I think, now in the middle of a module about Fanon. And clinically, I think there are people who've reached out to me of various organizations that want to do clinical Fanonian stuff. I've taught like 12-week courses or something like that around Fanon. The Brooklyn Institute teaches it. But I don't know if people are asking about a clinical application of Fanon. I don't know anything off the top of my head about that. But let me link the Abolition School for you all.
Thank you. Oh, someone is saying they'd be very interested in clinical application of Fanon, clinical applications. Yeah.
Maybe I'll teach that course.
There is demand for the course.
But maybe I'll revive it.
And oh wait, okay. Hamad asked, and it was, I don't know if it was in a particular context, if you're still here, that you want to share. Are there parallels to what Paulo Freire said about the inability of the oppressed to their reality?
So liberation, of course, that's liberation, theology liberation, educational liberation, right, through Paulo Freire, and then Ignacio Martin Baro takes in this liberation psychology, right? And I do think that, yes, of course, the oppressor, if I've understood the question correctly, is the oppressor means to disconnect oppressed people from the source of their knowledge and from all the methods in which oppressed people know themselves, know their communities, know their way to liberation. And when I say no, that doesn't mean that's a fixed position of like upfront, we know, but it is about confusing people about the legitimacy of their knowledge ways. And instead implanting a supremacist belief about what knowledge counts and what doesn't. There is nothing more clear about that than in a Eurocentric psychological process that has turned itself into a science, right? And a method that sort of discounts all indigenous knowledge ways, all knowledge ways of people the world over, would make people believe through, whether that's through manualized treatments or methods or processes or anything else, that to actually make them doubt themselves and their visceral knowledge that might come to them from their community, from their ancestors, from knowledge that comes before them, and that outdates the invention of modern psychology and psychoanalysis, certainly. And that doubt is not just a cognitive doubt. That's what I mean about an intrusion that rewires our interiority. And that's what causes alienation. So again, liberation psychology along Paulo Freire and Martin Baro, the through line is we are not here to impart knowledge from above on people. People know and are attached to the source of their liberation. It is our job to walk alongside them and be as committed as they are to the dismantling of the conditions that might confuse them away from that, whether that is poverty or health inequities or imperialism or settler colonialism or Zionism. Those are ferocious processes that can alienate people. Our job is to be as committed to dismantling those as the people themselves. And I think that's how it's similar to Ferdi and Martin Baro.
We those were the questions actually. So Franklin and Kaushik, I don't know if you have, I mean, we're almost at 8:30. So
We're almost at 8:30, and Franklin
yeah.
and I have like 12 questions that we're
Yeah.
dying to ask. So if it's okay with you, Lara, I'll jump in with, we decided which one on time
Absolutely.
just now.
Yalla, yalla. We got
Jump in
you.
with it. Okay. All right. Okay. I want to bring in the Global South. And we talked about the Global South on Turtle Island, and I'm from South Asia. I want to bring it in. I'm always thinking about caste. Being from Global South, from South Asia, you can't avoid it, and you shouldn't avoid thinking about it. And in the first chapter of your book, and in your talk just now, in today, you spoke about you speak about psyops, the state sort of led psyops, and you also talk about how psychic intrusions happen at a very mundane, banal level as well. And that got me thinking about how psychic intrusions are actually a primary means of caste practices and a primary means of enacting dispossession, material dispossession. This is how caste practices are mobilized. And I want to give a couple of examples of this banality. If it's okay, I feel like like instead of asking, saying. But an example would be the tone of voice in which a dominant caste person talks, or the entitlement that a dominant caste person might have to just cut in line, right? And what that does is both act as a specific psychic intrusion into the person who receives it, the person it's directed at, and it creates a less than placeness within them. But at the same time, it normalizes and organizes psychosocially the oppressive order of things. Like it literally, when I read that chapter, I was like, oh, Lara is describing how caste works, like very precisely. And so I'm curious about I'm just curious about this question of mundane, banal, everyday psychic intrusions, and I want to ask you for more around that.
Yes. Thank you also so much for bringing that in, because I think this was the hope. I say it several times in the book, but this was my hope, is that these examples I give don't act as like the holding spaces as though that's the only thing. It becomes a portable logic we can use across the board. And you've done exactly that by saying this is exactly what caste is, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was so meaningful to me that it's landed on you in that way, and that you can see yourself in that way, and then read the locale, because we all have regional and local specificities that this plays out on. And that's precisely, power relies on us not being able to have a portable logic that we can read these things and then instead be like, but what does this have to do with this? This happens over there, and this happens over here. And then we're stuck talking about that. And that's the point. That's the deflection, right? Like here we are arguing about the semantics. Is caste the same as, as the South was after slavery? Like, who cares? That's not the point. The point is power does the same thing and works on hierarchical processes. And please understand, when I say who cares, that doesn't mean I don't care about the people and what that looks like to them, right? But it comes from the place of, when we get sidetracked into those arguments, let's recognize that as part of the project of power, is that we're doing that instead of doing exactly what you just did, is said, hey, this is exactly what this looks like, right? And what I would offer is that caste in this way is perhaps a consolidated form of a tapestry of psychic intrusions that come together in a consolidated form to become a systemic issue, right? And to become a systemic issue that then becomes naturalized and normalized, such that there are many people that might not see it. The people who end up seeing it are the people who end up feeling it, who end up having to be under the boot of it, who their every single day life is circumscribed by the effects of that, right? And still, if they name it, they're looked at like, what are you talking about? Caste is not here anymore, right? That's another part of it, right? So there's also like and what I would say is that it cannot become a consolidated form that is felt in that way if there isn't an entire infrastructure that is there to mobilize. So one of the things why I wanted to go through PsyOps was to say to people, like, we think about psychological operations in these, again, these spectacular forms, the experiments that were done on people, some of them in Canada, MK Ultra, for example, happening, where they experimented on people with what they call brainwashing, injected people with, and when I say people, it's usually Black folks and Indigenous people and folks of color, but by and large, Black folks, who are injected with substances, what happens to them, experimentation. This is the history of psychology, right? Is experimenting on people to find out, just like we saw in Guantanamo Bay, experimenting largely on Muslims and Arabs to see enhanced interrogation techniques, which is shorthand for torture, right? See how that is experimentation that is used. So there's that's what I mean by like, I wanted to start there because psychological operations, like I said, are studied, but they shift over time from these spectacular forms to the architects of PsyOps actually saying, for us to have the full impact we need to have, psychological operations have to happen in times of peace, not times of war. Meaning what? They need to happen every single day. And they need to happen every single day in a way that we're not even aware of them. Now, here are all the structural pieces that help this infrastructure that helps that. Caste is one of them. Cis heteropatriarchy is another one, right? Class is another one. Ableism is another one. All these ways in which it can be mobilized in particular ways. But that's the thing, is like they can't pop into motion unless the infrastructure is there. Caste works because the internalized infrastructure is there for it to work in that way, right? And I think this is the thing, is to name that. Now, one of the things I also am very careful about in the book, and I hope it comes through, is like, I'm not asking for like I think people might rightfully say, okay, so what, Lara, like we engage in psychic militancy, nothing changes materially, right? This is a manifestation out of our, material conditions. That's not what I'm talking about. Absolutely. We could engage in psychic militancy and caste still exist. But what we are doing is not allowing caste to exist without us naming that it is a violent process that was mobilized in particular ways by colonizers and elites alike, and that continues to have social and political currency for the same ends that its very inception had in mind, was a supremacist logic that kept people in their place. Being able to say that over and over and over again allows us then maybe to forge possibilities in which that material reality can actually change. But if we don't engage in psychic militancy, the theft of our psyche ensures that the violent, disgusting world we live in stays in its place. That's really at the heart of it, is being like, can we make and ensure possibilities for material change? And my worry is that when we concede our psychic space, the material realities of the impossibilities of liberation actually happen. We often think material concessions happen first. And in my sense and in my belief is psychic concessions happen first, and then everything else is possible. So for us to engage in psychic militancy is to say, we refuse those possibilities. And then how we enact that materially is likely to happen, like we see every single day. Like when we see a farmers movement, a farmer laborers movement fighting for their rights across India, when we see Kashmiris refusing and saying, no, this is the settler colonial process, despite the atrocious violence against them, those are reminders to us that like people under the most impossible conditions always find a way to resist. And that is the point of psychic militancy, is to be like, we can't succumb to the story that power tells, that there are no possibilities, because we have so many examples that tell us it's just not true.
Thank you. Jonathan, you want to come in?
I think we're at our time. I wish we could just ask you questions all night, Laura, but we won't do that to you. We'll just remind people to please buy the book. And thank you for spending so much time with us. I'm going to pass things over to Divya to close us off tonight.
Thank you both so much.
Ooh, what a beautiful and inspirational talk. So huge thank you to Lara for your clarity and conviction and inspiration. And thank you, Franklin, Kaushiki, Tanya, Tala, for the questions, for consolidating audience questions. It was clear in the audience that actually having this conversation and bringing these truths so openly is in and of itself helping to heal and unlearn and undo some of the gaslighting that we have in ourselves, our systems, our society. So if you haven't already, please get a copy of Lara's book. We're going to email the link. The link's posted. You can copy and paste it from the chat. And please boycott Indigo and Amazon and shop local wherever you can. Thank you to everyone who has spent your time. Well, your time is precious. So thank you for sharing in the chat. There's some really powerful experiences as well and lots of amazing connections. And then we'll also email a link to the recording later. Thank you for your donations. We raised $1,700 today. So as a reminder, your donations allow us to compensate our speakers, to cover the operational costs for putting on these events. And we always donate the rest to a grassroots organization of the speaker's choosing. So for this event, donations will help support Al Tansikiya Al Shabiya, a Lebanese mutual aid campaign for displaced families in Lebanon. And we're going to share the link for people to follow and support directly as well. Our next event is on July 12th at 12 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be featuring Shaza Abudaya, a Gaza-based psychologist, writer, and journalist. Shaza will share her reflections on trauma, resilience, meaning-making, and redefining the role of the therapist within the context of an ongoing genocide. She'll speak about the limitations of traditional mental health models when applied to a violently colonial reality, and how practitioners can become more aware of the political and ethical dimensions of their work. She'll also explore forms of support and solidarity that move beyond the individual level toward a more collective responsibility. You don't want to miss Shaza's powerful message. Also, please look out for emails from us. We will be sending you the follow-up. We've put together, I know some people asked about resources, so we've put together lists for things to follow. Lara will get maybe the resources you mentioned and include those links as well so that they're there. And we need more people to do anti-colonial work. So whether you're already organizing or you're totally new to it, we want to put out these resources to help you connect and to organize. We have a WhatsApp community and we will send the link for that. We hope you join. It's a space you can keep the conversation going between the events, connect with others, and really invest in liberatory approaches to mental health. Lastly, if you want to support us with these events, with the advertising, we are looking for people to support if you have design skills, PR, videography, community outreach. So if you email Therapists for Palestine at proton.me, or you can connect with us on Instagram. Yeah, it takes a team and it takes a village. So we welcome people that are feeling passionate or drawn to doing that. That brings us to the end of our event today. We look forward to staying connected with you all. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lara, again, for
Thank you
your
all
time
so
and
much.
energy.
I really, 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 really appreciate spending time with you.